Hello.
Gary, can you see me? Can you see our crowd? Can you hear me?
I can.
That's wonderful. Okay. It is my great pleasure. Gary has to leave. Well, I'm getting an echo here. That's not good. Gary has to leave in an hour, almost exactly in an hour, because he has a class after this. It is my great pleasure to introduce Gary Libecap, Professor Larry Libecap, who has taught a class on the Dust Bowl for how many years?
Well, I've worked on various natural resource issues for a long time.
Okay, we will not delve into that. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Libecap, and he will talk for, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, and then it becomes a question and answer session. Go ahead. Oh, one more thing. Professor Libecap is having some audio problems at his end, so please speak slowly and clearly. Professor Libecap, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I actually didn't know there were any libertarians in Boulder, so that's good to know.
Professor Libecap, just 1 second. I need that sound sync, that clap.
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay. I imagine they're about as rare as here in Santa Barbara, but in any event. So, when Ralph asked me about the Dust Bowl, I told him that the Dust Bowl, even though it was an incredible environmental event, maybe one of the largest in U.S. history, and it led to all sorts of history, as well as literature, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and then a whole series of photography and migration out of the Great Plains to California and elsewhere. Nevertheless, it was not due to the landscape, even though the landscape is conducive to wind and drought. It was due to the farm policy or the land allocation policy put into place by the government back in the latter part of the 18th century. The U.S. is unusual in its allocation of land. Ultimately becomes the Homestead Act and related land laws. Other places that had large expanses of land were not assigned to individuals or allocated to individuals quickly and smoothly. Of course, Russia comes to mind, Argentina, Brazil. In these places, land was really held in large plots for the political elites. In the U.S., there was this notion of dividing the land up and transferring it from government ownership to private individuals as quickly as possible. And so I think that was a very good thing. It was part of the Jeffersonian notion of a nation of smallholders would have people who had a stake in the society, people who would participate in the economy, at a time when agriculture was the primary source of economic activity. Small farm allotments then worked very well in the northern parts of the U.S. Because there were no important economies of scale, and so you could allocate or make possible individual claiming of 30 acres or 60 acres or 80 acres or even 160, and that would be plenty for a farm. And everybody, from politicians to bankers to store owners to farmers, engaged in land speculation. It was the primary way in which people lived a lot of life. This process moved across the agricultural frontier in the north from the early part of the 19th century, really very successfully. And when it encountered the drier parts of North America beyond the 100th meridian, people basically jumped over that and went to California and Oregon. But by the very late part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century, all of the land that was easily claimable, that is, land that was arable, that fit the 160-acre allotments under the Homestead Act, had been claimed. And as a consequence, there is renewed interest in the more arid parts of the continent. This is mirrored also up in Canada. They're competing for the same immigrants. So what happened, but there was really no experience with a semi-arid climate. People in the eastern U.S. did not have that experience. People in Europe did not have that experience. And so there were a variety of theories that developed with regards to how to farm dry places. And ironically, given the current concern about the damage that people might do to the climate, at that time, they actually thought that people could do a good thing for the climate, and that was under this notion that rain would follow the plow. And so that if you homesteaded dry places, it would encourage rain to fall because it would break up the flow of the wind across the land and so forth. And this led to a lot of, there's kind of an interesting literature on this. At the same time, the Department of Agriculture investigated a variety of ways to sustain eastern agricultural practices in western parts of the U.S. Through dry farm cultivation and what have you. The result of all this was that most of the western Great Plains was settled densely by homesteaders in a manner very similar to the eastern Great Plains in eastern Dakotas, Minnesota, and Iowa, and so forth. And as it turns out, that also was a time of relatively high levels of moisture. And so this all seemed to work. It seemed to confirm the hypothesis that rain would follow the plow and what have you. But a series of droughts hit starting in 1916 and started to cast doubt on this, but also started to cast doubt on the viability of 160-acre farms. As you probably know, in Colorado, and you drive out, you'll see failed homesteads. You don't see anything like this in any other part of the country, farm failure, because farms didn't fail. Farms were sold and consolidated, but farms did not fail, but they did fail in the Great Plains. And so why is that? They were too small. So what happens in about 1929, an unprecedented shift in drought patterns predates climate change. You can only imagine what people would have thought if we'd had the same sort of mindset at that time. But nevertheless, for about 10 years, you get high temperatures, low levels of precipitation, and accompanied by prevailing winds. And so this set up all of the potential for wind erosion. Now, wind erosion is something you can combat, and you can combat it in a variety of ways, but we had no experience with that. And so initially, as things dried out and crops failed and erosion began, then there was this problem of how to get all of these hundreds of thousands of small farmers to cooperate in a manner to fight erosion. And the Soil Conservation Service, which was part of the deal at the time, had sent out multiple folks to help farmers deal with this growing problem of erosion. And they suggested things and stripping and cropping pads that you're familiar with for wheat and so forth, strip cropping. And so the way those would work would be that as wind flowed across the soil and picked up soil particles and then encountered last year's stubble, it would slow the wind slightly, and that would cause the wind to deposit any soil particles that it happened to be carrying. And so that would reduce this problem of wind erosion. If you ran into an even higher barrier, such as a windbreak, then that process would even be magnified. So they learned pretty quickly how to deal with wind erosion. But then there was this problem of all these small farms. And there were two important problems there, these homesteads. One was that in semi-arid parts of the country, where productivity was relatively low, you had to put the entire farm into cultivation. Effective wind erosion control required between a third and half the farm to be left in fallow. In this case, if you were growing wheat, in stubble, or to plant windbreaks. Windbreaks, those trees compete for water and nutrients. And then, of course, leaving a third to half the farm in stubble means that's not in crops and they're not generating income. Small farms just did not have that access, that ability to access capital, to get them from one year to the next. So, on one hand, they did not have the wherewithal to cut back. But secondly, they had little incentive because they were so small that you had a tragedy of the commons problem, in the sense that if I am one farmer and I combat wind erosion on my farm by having windbreaks or crops, the soil that is saved will fall on my neighbors. Because my farm is so small, I will put all the windbreaks up, but the benefits will go downwind. And so there was very little incentive for these individual small farms to do that, and they didn't. And when I was working on this some time ago with a PhD student, we went to the National Archives, and there are all these records on farm side, these maps and wind erosion intensity maps and farm size and so forth. Where you see it becomes very clear that on larger farms, larger ranches, you just don't have the same level of damage or wind erosion, because a larger farm actually would internalize some of the benefits of combating wind erosion, but these small farms just did not. So if you magnify this across all of the Great Plains, it just creates an incredible problem. And over 10 years, these folks could last 1 year, they could last 2 years, they could last 3 years, but ultimately they don't, and they fail, and they leave and migrate out. And so for many of the counties in western Dakotas, for example, until the recent oil boom, the largest populations that those counties had were noted in the 1910 census. And then after that, it's all downhill. And I'm sure there's something like that in eastern Colorado and what have you. So the origins, and so it's important to note that in the 1950s and 1970s, we have comparable climatic patterns whereby we have hot temperatures, wind, and drought, but we don't get a dust bowl. And why don't we have a dust bowl during that period, during those periods, is by that time farms were much, much larger. Now, it is true, and I have to admit, I think, that the government did play a role in bringing farms together to cooperate to fight wind erosion in the 1930s. And they did this through the creation of these soil conservation districts. And essentially, because the optimal allotment to fight wind erosion was about 200,000 acres, and there's no farm that would be economical at that size, or no ranch. So you really had to find a way to bring them together. And since the government actually had created the problem by having farms too small, this actually was a useful organization to bring parties together. And the reward for them joining was they got a variety of government subsidies that they would not get if they didn't join. The student and I actually looked at to see who the major proponents for the adoption of soil conservation districts in particular areas, who the proponents were, and they were almost always larger farmers. And that's understandable. They were the ones that had stake and the ones that were already trying to fight wind erosion. But given they were surrounded by a bunch of small farmers, could not. Another thing we did on this regard is we asked the question, well, why was the Homestead Act not adjusted to meet the conditions of the Western U.S., the drier Western U.S.? And as I mentioned earlier, everybody was involved in land speculation. There was little experience with semi-arid regions, and at the time of migration into this part of the country, no one was really convinced, certainly politicians weren't convinced, that you needed larger farms. And there was a downside for them, because if you went from 160-acre plots in the population that would support to 16,000-acre plots in the population that would support, you can see it'd be a dramatically smaller population. Dramatically smaller populations meant that there would be less opportunity to go from being a territory to a state. And if you're an aspiring politician, this just reduces your opportunities to move up the political ladder. So we use that as an argument why, and then we have some quotes from when these sorts of discussions would come up in Congress, and who opposed changes in the land laws and what have you. And it wasn't a statistical test, but it was certainly consistent with the notion that if you don't understand the underlying problem and it seems like the solution could harm you, then you're not going to support it. So the land laws were never changed, and they remained as restrictive as they were. The final thing I want to mention is, so the land laws are important in terms of why we had the Dust Bowl. But they have a lingering, perhaps even more important legacy today. And that is, you live in Colorado and everybody else, we all know that massive amounts of land are owned by the federal government. In fact, the U.S. government owns more land as a share of the size of the government of the country than it does Sweden or Germany or virtually any other, or even Canada. So this ostensibly market-oriented society and economy has a government that owns far more land. These are often called the public lands, and that feels very kind of warm and fuzzy. And among their students here at the School of the University of California, Santa Barbara, they are very fond of them because these are lands that they think of as, in quotes, theirs. and that they somehow have special access to or privileges to use and so forth. But that was never part of any scheme. Those public lands that we call public lands, I refer to them as constituent group lands, those are the outcome of the federal land laws. That is, you could not, under the land law, under the Homestead Act, claim any more than 160 acres. And if you got Nevada, it's just not going to get you very much. And so, for most places that primarily relied on ranching, individuals would claim 160 acres as needed. They would have their relatives or friends claim adjacent properties and what have you. And then the rest would be effectively occupied for grazing. That works for a while, but they never get title to that. There's never any adjustment in the land laws. And so finally, when the Taylor Grazing Act was passed in, I think, 1934, it's all formally transferred to the federal government and then later placed under the Bureau of Land Management. So that's the origin of those types of public lands today, is they don't have particular amenity values or like Yellowstone or Rocky Mountain National Park or what have you. They're just they're lands that you couldn't claim under the land laws. And so they have been permanently delegated to bureaucratic and political management. And it's to no surprise they were managed lands. It's a similar story for the Forest Service lands. The land laws did not allow the claiming of property for forests, for timber harvest. They were agricultural land laws. So if you wanted to get private lands for forests, you had to act like a farmer, and many companies did. Now, there were railroad land grants and others, and so that's how Weyerhaeuser in Washington State acquires a lot of land. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. That's where all of that unclaimed forested land was placed under the Forest Service, under the Forest Service that we have today. And we all know all of the problems associated with creating national monuments and what have you, bureaucratic control and the lobbying that is underway by various interest groups as to how they want or the national forests or BLM lands managed. Has a great deal of uncertainty to those lands. And as I mentioned before, if you compare those lands with similar private lands, there's just no question they're in far worse shape, almost on any dimension. So that's kind of the wrap up. The public land laws or the land laws were the source of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and they're really the source of many of the debates over national monuments and public lands, BLM and Forest Service lands. Hey, so there's my quick and dirty overview.
Okay. Are there any questions? Because I have a lot of them.
Okay.
Well,
I'd like to ask you a question, and I'm ready for the answer to be I don't know, okay? We've seen these kinds of things, like the Dust Bowl, occur in other countries, like currently in Africa, okay? Is there a relationship to government programs, land management in other countries that have had famine and have had Dust Bowls, that sort of thing? Do you have any knowledge on that?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of
Okay.
when you said we see these kinds of patterns. Did you say in Africa?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay.
And at one time
Well-
growing up, people were starving in China and
Yeah.
Bangladesh.
Exactly. Well, I mean, the good news for us is that we got access to land, and North America, for the most part, is really good land. people in most of the places that you read about in Africa or wherever there are widespread famines, those are not privately held lands for the most part. I mean, those are either nomadic peoples, but they have no way of getting title to their land. They're subject to all sorts of ineffective or hostile bureaucracies and so forth. And so those are continuing stories. I mean, if you look back 15 or 20 years ago, those are the same places that have problems then, that have problems today. It's a tragedy, but unfortunately it's not our tragedy.
Thank you.
Lee,
Is
so
that
you
on?
don't, you're fine.
Okay.
But speak slowly and clearly.
To what extent did the easy money policy of the 1920s have in encouraging settlers or farmers to go into debt essentially over their head, that they had no chance of repaying because of the difficulty of making 160 acres work? What did that contribute to the rate of bankruptcy and abandonment?
To be honest, I haven't looked at sort of easy money policies. Even if there have been hard money policies, I don't think it would have mattered. These farms were too small. They were too small under any circumstance. But they were settled on, their drought patterns are cyclical. And as it turned out, in the latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century is a wet period. We looked at, in a different study, we looked at farm failure. We were able to get kind of parcel level data in Montana and county and city directories, so we know what farms existed at a particular point in time and follow them across time for 10 years or more when there would be droughts, and get an idea of which ones failed and which ones did not. Now, we didn't have information on indebtedness, which you make reference to, but it's not going to surprise you that larger farms survived and small farms failed. And this isn't prior to the Dust Bowl, but the problem with small farms is they almost had to be monocrop and have very little livestock, because you couldn't really have crops and livestock and make enough money on how small that, given the low carrying capacity and the small size of the farm. Whereas larger farms, we're not talking giant ones here, maybe 1,200 acres or whatever versus 60. But nevertheless, they could have livestock as well as wheat, maybe potatoes, and so forth. So they'd have a mix. And so if you had prices collapse, which happened in the early 20s, for wheat, then you'd still have potatoes or you'd still have livestock. And then as the droughts kicked in, you'd still have livestock, or you'd have resilient crops to earn income on. But on the other hand, if you had a small farm, you were totally wheat, and when wheat collapsed, you collapsed. So money could have been a part of the problem, but I don't think it was the dominant one.
Anybody else before I jump in with a whole bunch of questions? Okay. Question number one. Libertarians love to talk about minarchism versus anarchism. Am I coming in clearly, sir?
I'm sorry, Ralph, say that one more time.
Okay. Libertarians love to talk about minarchism, small government, versus anarchism, no government. So, please give me your assessment. There was this huge amount of land out there, which I guess was, you could look at it as nobody owned or the government owned. What would be a anarchist solution to the purchase of that land so that you make a claim to it and get an optimal sized farm without, people shooting at each other.
Well, as it turns out, we actually had that opportunity. And from my point of view, I think it worked very well economically and socially and politically, in the sense that when the settlement process is moving across the 100th meridian, which runs from the center of the Dakotas down to Texas, the government that owned that land was in Washington, D.C., and it was tiny, certainly relative to today. It had really no ability to enforce its claims, particularly. When the gold rush took place, for example, so here's your example of anarchy, but it didn't happen, is that you had hundreds of thousands of people traveling across North America to work the mines. But these weren't mines. They had to find ore-bearing soil deposits. But then they had to have some kind of system whereby they could claim and mine and not have to spend all their time patrolling their claims. And so you had virtually hundreds of mining camp governments formed. Nobody's coming out from Washington, D.C., or they're not coming down from Sacramento, or over from Sacramento, or Denver, or Helena, or wherever. These are all local, spontaneous arrangements. And from that, you get a system of private mineral rights. We didn't have them before because we really had no minerals to speak of in the eastern U.S. Later, some were discovered, but there really weren't many mineral deposits until you get out to the west. So those mining camp rules, and they're very similar across the western U.S., get enshrined in territorial and state law, and then in the federal mining law of 1866, I guess it is, in 1872, which is the mining law that we live with today. Environmentalists do not like it because it allows for privatization, but nevertheless, this was a voluntarily spontaneous system of dealing with the cost of anarchy, which would have meant you couldn't really mine. You'd be spending all your time fighting, and so it wasn't productive. A similar arrangement developed, which also is not liked. It went here in Sacramento, and nor among many environmentalists. Actually, I teach in an environmental school. You can see I'm a short patient. And that's prior appropriation of water rights. So the good news for the U.S. is that we have a water rights system. Most of the world does not. And so as water gets scarcer and scarcer and whatever, it's going to be hard to figure out how that's going to be managed as a resource. But in the western U.S., we have the priority system. In the eastern U.S., it's riparian, so we get access to water based on your land that's adjacent to the stream. As settlers came across the continent, and especially as they encountered Colorado, that riparian system just doesn't work anymore. There aren't enough streams. Besides, the most productive land isn't adjacent to the stream. And so you want some way to get access to water so that you can make land productive. And you want some way to have a group of people coalesce to develop these irrigation systems, these canals. All this predates the Reclamation Service. And so what another student and I did was still using Colorado data. We looked at the water rights system. And so basically what they set up was a priority system. The first party to claim water on a stream had to claim a fixed amount of water, and they had to put it to use, and they could move it off stream. And so the good news about that is it didn't matter how many other people came and claimed land along that stream later, you had your guaranteed amount. Now, it might be that the stream flow would fluctuate and you wouldn't always get that, but nevertheless, nobody else would be able to claim your water. And so that's why I thought it made sense to fix the diversion amount. If it had been a riparian system, if they'd tried to add the riparian system, the way that works, it's a share of the water in the stream. And so if you have one person on a stream, that person essentially has access to 100% of the water, two people, 50%. You can see the problem. And then if you want to invest in a very capital-intensive irrigation system to move water off stream, then you got to get a bunch of folks together, and you have to know that you're going to have enough water to put into that canal system. And a riparian system just never would have supported that because you could never be sure you'd have enough water. What we do is develop a little framework and then look at different sectors, Castle Polluter and other parts of Colorado, and how this led to these dramatic and all private irrigation systems. And if you look at I think it's the 1900 census, or it might be the 1910 census, by that time there's almost $1 billion in private irrigation infrastructure, $1 billion in today's dollar, put in to get all private, no federal reclamation service or anything. The reclamation service is primarily a way to get taxpayers to pay for these big irrigation systems. So I'm not that fond of them, frankly, but nevertheless, privately. So back to your original question, Ralph, this was spontaneous. There was no federal government intervening. Even today, water is a state prerogative primarily, and despite the Clean Water Act's efforts to make that different. But so anarchy is costly, it just doesn't work. So people get together and find ways to cooperate, so long as they're able to do that.
And Lee, just to interrupt you, we only have 20 minutes left, so keep your questions short.
Just a quick comment, perhaps correction. Anarchy is actually the correct term to describe what you just related as what happened when private people got together and solved this problem. Anarchy really doesn't mean no government. I would characterize it as meaning no state.
Oh, okay. I'm totally on board with that. These were private efforts to address a problem, and they were successful. And sometimes I'll even go so far as to say you can actually have a limited government to assist that. It's just the problem is how you put the brakes on that limited government from, it's a slippery slope.
Anybody else before I just jump in? And I will jump in. In these spontaneously organized self-government systems, were there competing, quote-unquote, governments, and was there violence between these competing forms of competing centers of self-government? And how was that, and if there wasn't, how was that avoided?
So far as I know, there was no violence. When I was working on my dissertation, unfortunately a long time ago, I was working on mineral rights, and I had this notion that this was going to be a lot of Wild West, shoot 'em up stuff, and turned out to be incredibly boring, the data collection, but there also wasn't any of what you described. The people were out in these mining camps. They wanted, they're, you know where they are, they're high in elevation. The weather is pretty awful. They have no amenities, even though they try to make these towns seem as permanent and as glorious as they could be. It still were a long ways from anywhere where people wanted to be. And so what they wanted to do was to mine and get out. And they put together the structure, and they weren't investing in, I mean, nobody wanted to make, as far as I know, wanted to make a career as a local mineral rights registrar or whatever. That was their part-time job. Their main job was to be a miner because they wanted to strike it and move on. And for the most part, they did. And these discoveries are very have one in one gulch or canyon and another in another one. So there wasn't any reason for them to infringe upon each other because ore veins didn't, overlap. So they weren't, it's so much like oil, an oil pool between Kuwait and Iraq or something like that, where they were competing after the same thing, or a fish, wild ocean fish stock that goes from Japan down to Australia or something. So you didn't have that, and the same is true with water districts. Now they get enshrined in Colorado law pretty rapidly because there's so much money at stake in terms of rate of this ditch infrastructure. So and there was conflict there, but not between governments, but between I would divert. A group of us would divert this, for example, at Greeley, and they build these canals. They're moving water out for irrigation, and then folks up at Fort Collins would divert and essentially take water through Greeley. So they would while they're fighting over it, maybe the water was diverted, not available for them. So it had to be solved, and Colorado set up a pretty effective water court system, and other states don't really have it for whatever reason as effectively defined as Colorado does.
Blake.
I really like what you're saying about Colorado and the history of it. The history of it. I'm new to Colorado myself, so I just really enjoy hearing about what they did. But I'm curious, which came first, the private compacts or government regulation?
Which came first?
Yep.
He's asking you to repeat. Which one? The two others.
Yes, that's correct. Which came first?
A government or
I'm
private
getting there.
Okay.
Just took a bite. Sorry, Robbie.
He's having trouble hearing.
So which came first? The private compacts where individual regulation?
Oh, there's no question. There is absolutely no question on this. These private arrangements, you have to remember governments are tiny at this time. And so you get the private arrangements, and when you need it, so if you have a ditch association on one part of the Cache La Poudre and another ditch association further up, and they were in conflict, you really did need a third party. And since this gets magnified across the state, then the legislature enacts these various laws about precedent and having measurement and documentation of who claims at what time and so forth, and setting up the court system to arbitrate disputes. This occurs not only in water, it occurs in grazing, it occurs in mining. It's always these private arrangements first, and then government.
Anybody else? It is now 1:15. We have 15 minutes left. So, stories of claim jumping, are they overblown?
Oh, I think so. I mean, it's hard to on one hand, hard to test that, but claim jumping was damaging to everybody. And so as a consequence, because it undermined, if you discovered ore, and what you wanted to do was to mine it, and you didn't want to have to hire a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of engineers to document where your vein went and then spend time testifying and what have you, because while that's happening, one, you can't raise money on capital markets because there's an uncertainty about your claim, but also maybe the competitors taking your ore. And so this is pretty damaging. Now, that being said, there were famous cases, especially up in Montana, up in Butte, over conflicting ore veins, and because these things would come so close to one another. But nevertheless, once that gets sorted out, then it's business as usual. It's cranking away and what have you. So, like I said, when I was back working, I was using old newspapers at the time to get dates of claims, but also these claims were, shares of them were sold, and I was trying to get share prices. There's almost nothing in those local, I was working on the Comstock Globe in Virginia City. There's almost nothing in the Virginia City or Nevada, Western Nevada papers about a lot of violence. Like I said, it's pretty boring stuff. I hired my wife to help, and she was hoping for a lot of juicy stuff, but it turned out not to be like that. So I had more of an enforcement problem keeping her working on it than anything. It makes for good TV, and it makes for great, movies and great novels and what have you. But in practice, violence is pretty costly, and so you can't do much over the long term if you're fighting all the time.
Frank.
I'll go down the violence route, hoping to still find some, and mentioning the novel. I think it's the Oxbow incident that has the vigilantes in it. So, did you find vigilantes surfacing that often, or if ever?
Well, I didn't really, I think it's occur when there isn't a kind of a structure to there's violation of the rules, and the rules aren't being enforced, and that whatever structure is put in place isn't effective. So you had these kind of local mobs, which you think the vigilantes as dealing with this problem. Now, here's a related one that I've heard about. I don't have it off the top of my head, but there are studies. There have been economic studies. One of the arguments is that the mafia developed in southern Italy, not in northern Italy, but in southern Italy, because in southern Italy there just was no effective institutional arrangement to deal with anything, and so the mafia provided that. Whereas in the north, you had, more local customs that would replace courts and what have you. So that's one of the arguments. It's just somewhat similar to vigilantes, but I don't think there were a few. There's the vigilantes in Virginia City, Montana, and there may be examples of that in Colorado. I'm just not familiar with them. I just don't think it's that often.
Thank you.
Anybody else? And me. We have 10 minutes left. Please, you know this story probably far, far better than I do. But it appears that it was an act of God got the federal government to mitigate the problems of the Dust Bowl when let me just ask if this is true, when a dust storm finally fell on Washington, D.C. That is my question. Would you care to comment on it, or did you hear it?
Oh, yeah, no, that's a famous one. Well, the argument, of course, was you have this real human tragedy of all these people out there who were brought because of the land laws. So you have too many people farming on too small plots, faced with a huge environmental challenge, catastrophe. So they're not necessarily starving, but they're destitute. They're financially been wiped out. So this is very appealing. Politicians think that, and are being called upon to do something. And the Soil Conservation Services sent hundreds of investigators out to look at the problem and have these test sites and so forth about how to deal with erosion. You have to remember, we never had this problem. We never dealt with this before. And certainly no European place that we had drawn upon for information had dealt with it before. So it was kind of all new. And this the story about this wind from Kansas, there was soil from Kansas being dropped on the Capitol. It may be true. In any event, it's part of the mythology of the whole thing that galvanized Congress to enact the Soil Conservation Acts. Now, of course, Congress was doing a variety of things with the Soil Conservation Act. It was also in the process of cartelizing agriculture, which they like to do even better. But nevertheless, it did create these soil conservation districts. Now, for a libertarian, the concern about this is once the problem is solved, those things don't go away. We still have them today. And that's the ratchet or the kind of asymmetry in all of this is once you get the state delivering and transferring resources from one party to another, those who are in the ascendancy, the receiving end of it, don't want to give that up. And so these structures just never go away. So, like I said, they're called something different today. I think they're called, they're not called soil conservation districts anymore. They're called something like, something broader and greener. Something more like environmental stewardship districts or something like that.
Okay. Anybody? Then I'll go again. On a personal note, are you a libertarian?
I'm sorry?
So am I. Are you a libertarian?
Am I a registered libertarian? Is that a party or a...
Philosophical ones first.
I am of course I'm a philosophical libertarian. I am so I'm in a school of very smart students and very smart faculty. It's all interdisciplinary graduate, natural and social science, people in National Academy of Sciences and so forth and so on. And so they're primarily think of government as benign, as government that will listen to them, and they're called upon to provide expert witnesses, and they're supportive of a variety of government agencies to do this, that, and the other thing. Students all love that. And I teach cost-benefit analysis, and so what does that do? I say, how much does this cost? And so for many of the students, the benefits are infinite, so how could you ever ask about cost? So I teach that, and then I teach a course called Environmental Markets, where we look at private ways to solve environmental problems. And then I teach over in the economics department a course on collective action and the tragedy of commons, about under what circumstances do people get together and solve environmental problems or resource problems, and when do they not. And but anyway, that collection has built me a little bit of a reputation. I don't want to say necessarily a positive one, but at least as an oddity in a faculty that otherwise is very California, coastal California.
We have 4 minutes left. Blake.
I would love, my sister lives in Orange County. I would love to meet you sometime I come to California. So please share your details with Ralph, and he'll get them to me. I especially love what you said today concerning there needs to be a third party to adjudicate events, because I could be an anarchist except conflict resolution doesn't happen if you don't have government. Perhaps it could, and others will disagree with me, but thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you need some structure, and to the degree to which that can be organized voluntarily and privately, all the better. I'm having an interesting, so we have very good students, as I mentioned. I'm having an interesting discussion with a Chinese student. And so in my class in environmental markets, so we're looking at fisheries, wild ocean fisheries, we look at water, we look at habitat credits to get around the Endangered Species Act, which is a huge problem in my view, and whatever. And so what much of this is about is how hard it is to put these into place, and yet how beneficial they can be, these arrangements to get private cooperation to solve problems. But you do need some kind of helpful third party often, and not one that's trying to undermine the local arrangements. But anyway, this Chinese student is quite skeptical about all this. He thinks it seemed pretty messy, and you made mistakes, and so forth. And so he is enamored with, naturally, again, kind of enamored with this meritocracy that seems to be kind of clean, and so if they want to get things done, they just do it, and it happens, and life goes on. And so when I asked him, I said, well, okay, all that's fine. I said, and things do seem pretty messy in the U.S. and kind of plod along, maybe miss a lot. But I said, we do have elections, and so if things go really bad, we can kick the people out, and maybe it doesn't change things that much, but nevertheless, it would have that remedy. I said, but what's the remedy in China? I said, if this meritocracy decides to be more like North Korea than China has been recently, I said, what's the remedy? Because I don't know, I think that's kind of a big question for them. It seems like the only remedy is revolution, which is pretty messy, so I don't know that necessarily they have a long-run solution there or not, but anyway.
It is now 12:29 in Professor Libecap's area. So I think we owe Professor Libecap a huge round of applause. I'm going to feel free to leave now, but I'm going to ask one more question. In the rain follows the plow, who was pushing that? Was that a conspiracy, or was the government doing that? Was it the railroads doing that? Who was promoting that, myth?
Oh, it's such a marvelous, positive, optimistic literature. It's just too bad it was wrong. It's it's one thing I love, frankly, that students don't have this today, but American history is just so optimistically good. Now, if you want to look at the bad side, they're clearly downsides. And so, but putting that aside, it's just a wonderful, incredible that you have this continent of natural resources and people getting access to them and being able to use them productively and so forth. And so, all in all, the American frontier is a wonderful, wonderful literature and experience. So in the latter part of the 19th century, when they're building railroads out here, they're finding this, they're finding that, new soil, new trees, new ore deposits. This just seemed like heaven on earth. And so everybody's writing these optimistic things, and so they get out to where it's drier, and it's not fitting the mold quite as well, but let's not change our optimism. And so you had all these kind of pop theories about how to deal with the new challenges, and this one of them was written. There's a reference in there that I could find, but nevertheless, this person, and there may have been multiple people that thought it, but that said it, but it was basically rainfalls of plow. They liked people in those days. They liked what people did. That people could actually turn a resource around and make it resource productive. And so that's why this notion, this optimistic notion, that if people plowed the land, stirred it up, that it would change the flow of air across the surface and encourage rain to fall. I mean, what could be more optimistic than that? I just had
Delusional.
a student yesterday in class. We were talking about water and life. So unlike land, why people have so many thoughts about it. And anyway, this one very bright student said, well, so we're talking about different solutions and patterns and data and whatever. And he says, well, we just haven't confronted the problem as people. We just have too many of them. And I just thought to myself, oh, is this just too bad? Because it's unfortunate that in the literature I was just describing, people were the solution. The problem was the environment. But that's why the Reclamation Service was called the Reclamation Service. It was going to reclaim the land. So anyway, but it's not thought that way anymore.
I don't want to keep you. You have another class to get to. So
Yeah, I've got to head out. So
yes. So again, please,
take your
everyone,
opportunity.
thank you so very much.
All right, bye.
Bye.